R3.
Senate Joint Resolution 3 by Senator Stubblefield, applying to the United States Congress to call a convention of proposing amendments pursuant to Article 5 of the United States Constitution.
Senator Stubblefield.
Thank you, Governor.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Governor. Most of you have put a handout on your desk showing what the Article 5 polls showed in Arkansas, and it showed that almost 70% of the people in Arkansas favor an Article 5 convention. You know, when I woke up this morning, I thought about something that happened, and Senator Bonds brought something up about President Clinton the other day in the committee meeting, and I thought about, you know, I remember in 1999 when President Clinton's Secretary of Labor, Robert Reich, he came out one morning and he wrote an op-ed, and in that op-ed, he said this, he said, there is no need for the American people to worry about the interruption of the work of Congress because of the impeachment proceedings, because everyone knows that the Federal Reserve controls the monetary system, the economic system, and they also know that the IMF controls foreign policy, and they also know that the President of the United States has the power to declare war. None of those are constitutional. But he also added, and let me finish that up. He said the dirty little secret is out that both houses of Congress have become totally irrelevant. You can look that op-ed up. That's the same sentiment that's prevalent today, but it's been prevalent for many decades before he made that statement. This Article 5 is not a Democrat, it's not a Republican issue. This is an American issue. Ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you something. We are faced with a debt. In fact, some of you may have got the email yesterday from the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, and the Government Accountability Office. In that email it said we are in uncharted waters. In other words, we owe $22 trillion in debt, with another $120 trillion in unfunded liabilities from Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, pension funds, student loans. That doesn't even take into account the personal debt owned by Americans. We are in uncharted waters. And some say, well, you know, this could go on. We really don't worry. And most Americans really don't have a clue because most of us really don't understand how much $22 trillion in debt is. And that same attitude prevailed among those who had never experienced an economic earthquake like those who lived in the Great Depression did. My mother and dad, many of your moms and dads, and certainly our grandparents who lived through the Great Depression. And they realized that the Great Depression didn't just happen overnight. In fact, it was a culmination of more than 2 decades of economic abuse. The promise of prosperity built on debt had tempted a lot of normally conservative Americans to risk all that they owned. And guess what? They lost. And now we have 85 years of economic abuse with no sight and end. No end in sight. What do you think? Does anybody in this chamber today really believe that Congress is going to wake up in the morning all of a sudden and say, we've got to cut our spending? Do you really believe that? Do you really believe that anything is going to change in Washington, D.C.? You know, Senator Flowers was talking this morning to City County Local, and I've worked with most of you for 6 years, some of you 8 years. And there's one thing about state legislatures that I have become aware of. We may not agree on a lot of different things, whether we're Republicans or Democrats, but most of the time we agree on how to, we don't agree on how to get there, but we agree on most things. We just don't agree on the avenue of how to get to that place. But we get along and we work together. We even like each other, Senator Cheatham. That's not so in Washington, D.C. Let me tell you something. They give these speeches in Washington, D.C. and talk about the interest of the American people? You know what it's really about in Washington, D.C.? It's about maintaining power. It's about buying committee chairmanships and buying leadership positions for millions of dollars. You don't have to watch the news very long to realize that Washington, D.C. cares very little about the American people. I will agree, there are a few up there. There are some good people in Washington, D.C. who have fought hard, but they are basically pushed aside because they don't go along with the flow. You know that as well as I know that. Congress has known this all along. They've known the kind of financial condition this country's in and what we're facing economically. They know this, and they know it's not sustainable. Senator Ingram and I talked about this a couple of months ago. We agree. The economic path we're on is not sustainable. We cannot continue to owe this kind of money. Just yesterday, the CBO said in 8 years, on the current path, we'll owe $30 trillion. $30 trillion. Now, most of you understand how government, the budget process works in Washington. Mandatory spending, discretionary spending. Back in the 60s, mandatory spending, the social programs, made up 35% of the budget. The discretionary spending, the military, education, infrastructure, that made up 75% of the budget. And we all know that today, those have flipped. They're just the opposite. And with $22 trillion in debt, in 5 years, just the interest, if there's no increase in interest. And by the way, 10 years ago, the bid to cover ratio on our U.S. debt, Senator Hickey, we talked about this, 3.8. Today it's 1.8. If it drops to 1.1, we can no longer borrow any money. Now, what do you think happens then? We have a Congress that's known this all along, and yet they refuse to address the problem. And yet, why should they? There's no incentive to, as long as they can keep getting reelected and maintain power in Washington. You and I have witnessed the greatest generational theft in this country's history. You and I, some of us that are older, may not experience it, but I can assure you, your children and your grandchildren and their children will experience it. Washington, their consensus is it's better to sink the nation with debt than to rock the boat to reform. We have surrendered control of our finances to a group of people that are so ignorant in basic economics, they don't even know how to run the country. Most of us grew up, our mom and dad, I run a business. My dad told me when I was a boy, you cannot continue to spend more than you take in. We all operate under that. That is a very simple economic fact. You cannot continue to spend more than you take. Why don't they do that in Washington? Our state does it. Most other states do it. Not true in D.C. 65% of all state budgets are controlled by Washington. We have nothing to say about it. 65% of all state budgets are controlled by Washington. And yet they continue to pass laws restricting the rights and freedoms of the majority of Americans while they exempt themselves in the process. I doubt many of you know, and I can assure you that most voters don't know, that Congress has exempted itself from civil rights, from anti-discriminatory laws. They've even exempted themselves from our retirement program, our school system, and even the normal daycare systems. They don't fall under the same guidelines that we do. I'm going to read to you something and see if you recognize these words. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. You know who said that? You know who said it, Senator Chesterfield? Dr. Martin Luther King said that. You know who he said it to? He was speaking to those who criticized his civil rights protest. They wanted him to wait for a better time for his movement to fight for racial equality in the United States. They argued that one day the culture would accept equal rights of African Americans. But Martin Luther King knew that wait almost always meant never. He knew that those in power would never willingly cede their authority, and it was up to the African American community and their supporters to fight for their rights as American citizens. And thank God he did. Well, that same principle that Martin Luther King believed in is the same principle that the vast majority of Americans believe in today. That the overreach and the abuse that's been perpetuated by the federal government will never end until we, the people, demand our freedom. There's only one way to do that, and it was provided for us in the Constitution. It's called Article 5, and it was the second clause in Article 5. 2 days before the Constitutional Convention ended, just 2 days, a guy by the name of Colonel George Mason stood up and he said, "Gentlemen, we've made a mistake. We have given Congress the ability to propose amendments, but we haven't given that same power to the people." And then he asked this question: do you believe that any government that becomes tyrannical would even propose amendments to restrain its own tyranny? Now, we know this to be true because all you have to do is read Madison's notes. James Madison was a very good note taker, and he wrote that down. And he wrote the words "nen com," 2 little words. Those words meant no comment, no debate. In other words, all those men that were assembled there, they found that that proposition was so obvious that the states would even have to restrain the federal government. They didn't even debate the issue. They never brought it up. And so they unanimously adopted the second clause of Article 5, giving the people, and by the way, if I remember correctly, in the Constitution it says that the powers delegated to the federal government were to be few and defined. Those to the states would be numerous and indefinite. You know what's happened? We have drifted so far from the original intent of the Founding Fathers, from the moorings of our Constitution, that we have flipped roles. Now the states have no power. The federal government has all the power. They merely use us as regional agencies to funnel our own tax dollars back to us through individual mandates, sometimes through unfunded mandates. And if you think that's going to get better, we can't even represent the people in our own state the way we want to represent them for fear of breaking a federal regulation or a federal rule. They unanimously adopted the second clause of Article 5. 75% of all Americans say the federal government is too big, it's too powerful, too involved in our lives. For so many years, we've trusted Washington, D.C. with our financial security. They have betrayed the trust. They've jeopardized the future of our children and our grandchildren. You and I have witnessed, I've told you before, the greatest generational theft in American history. Every U.S. congressman and every U.S. senator understands the cost of refusing to confront the exploding national debt. Like I said, we may not feel the results right now, but I can assure you someday our children and our grandchildren and their children, they will feel these results. And yet this coming crisis is one of Congress' own making, having promised far more in benefits than they ever made provision for the American people to pay for. And the founders knew. They knew the depravity of man, they knew the sinfulness of man, and they knew what power does. It's very addictive. And so they gave us a way to get out of this mess and to rein ourselves back in. Let me conclude by saying this. Our founding fathers, I believe, were men of faith. They had to be. They risked their lives, their families' lives, their fortunes, all for freedom. And for 180 years, we were a nation of faith. America was a nation of faith. That's not true any longer. We've become a nation of fear because we've traded in our independence for security, for promises from the government. I know because I spent a lot of time with my granddad who worked till he was 90 years old. He wouldn't take his Social Security because he didn't want to have anything to do with the government until finally one of his 8 daughters, his youngest one, no boys, talked him in and convinced him that that was his money. So he finally went down and took it and gave it to his girls. We don't have that independence, that faith anymore, because we're so afraid that the federal government is going to mess up and we're not going to get our checks, and we have to rely on them for everything. We've become a nation of dependence, not independence. And that faith was taken from us starting back in the 1960s when 9 robed judges began to take us down a path of removing the very foundation of our faith, which is God Himself. They took God from our education system. You see, the real threat to our Constitution today is not posed by a convention of states. A convention of states is merely a meeting where you propose amendments. You have gotten emails and letters calling it a con-con. A constitutional convention is for the purpose of writing a constitution. We already have a constitution. This method is simply to restore the Constitution to its original meaning, not rewrite the Constitution. It's basically that simple. So the threat today is not a convention of states, but rather an out-of-control federal government. And our founders telegraphed that message to us, showing us that there's a way back inside the fence of the Constitution. So with that said, members, I will take any questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Colleagues, Senator Clark mentioned Mount St. Helens. There was an individual by the name of Harry Truman living on Mount St. Helens, not the president. He was warned just a couple of weeks before it erupted that he needed to get off the mountain because there was a lot of activity going on underneath. He said, "I've lived here 60 years and it's never blown." Guess where Mr. Truman is today? He's 40 feet below volcanic ash on the side of Mount St. Helens. Senator Elliott, I fear a lot of things too. I also fear George Soros and 250 other groups. I fear our country is turning to socialism to replace a constitutional republic. That's what I fear. Whenever George Soros and 250 other groups have adamantly fought this initiative from day one, tells me a whole lot about Article 5. It tells me they are afraid of losing their power, their control over Washington, D.C., and it tells me they are afraid of the American people. That is who the founders were concerned with more than anything else. They gave all of the states complete sovereignty, and they said your powers are to be numerous, and the federal governments are to be few. That is no longer the case. Mr. President, I'm closed.
A vote of 19 yes, 13 against, 2 non-voting. The resolution passes.
Go to conventionofstates.com, press the button, sign the petition. More importantly, get 10 of your friends to do the same. When you sign the petition, then that sends a letter to your state legislator. You go on the list in their district as a supporter. We deliver those lists to the state legislators. It means something to them.